Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello friends, if you recall in the last lecture which we covered 19th century, at one point of time in the course of last lecture we briefly came across Vishnu Shastri Chiplunkar's invocation of Desh and his attempt to bring together the sense of pride and this category called Desh. Desh as a category has ambiguous meanings. For some, Desh means the immediate neighborhood, particularly for migrants it means native place. It is often translated as country or nation and is juxtaposed with another term Pardesh, alien land or foreign land. Desh in this sense has definitely spatial connotations, but in this connotation it is deeply embedded in cultural logic of language and experiences. This ambiguity, this plurality of meanings in Desh is quite crucial as we will see, and particularly today, that when we progress with time in context of our nationalist historiography, the engagement with Desh also keeps shifting in this discourse. So, with this prefacing, let us enter into the territory of late 19th and 20th century nationalist historiography. This in many ways we are building from our previous lectures. So, you will also notice a sense of continuity. However, by the end of this lecture you will notice that how grounds were constantly shifting at the same time. In 19th century historiography, if I would suggest a broad thematic continuity, a thematic thread that combines the 19th century historiographical concerns emanating from native intellectuals, then even at the risk of utter reduction in the complexity, I would tend to argue that the entire discourse, entire historiography was concerned with civilizational discourse. And in that wider context, in that particular tapestry, when Vishnu Shastri Chiplunkar is invoking this, or when in economic criticism a very rooted sense of, very clear sense of nation emerges, then we are encouraged to think about the relation between nation as a category in these historiographical journey, in this historiographical journey, and its linkages with the civilizational concerns. So, interplay between civilizational and nationalist discourses we will see often overlap. This is not to say that civilizational discourses are not nationalist discourses, but this intertwining, this ambiguity is crucial, and yet the distinction between the two may also be helpful for our purpose. When we enter into 20th century, this does not mean that we will not go back to late 19th century scenario. In fact, we will start with paying attention to the ideas particularly related to history in the hour of Bankim Chand Chattopadhyay. Then we will move to Rabindranath Tagore and briefly to Mahatma Gandhi. There is a particular reason why I am taking this trajectory, because these three individuals, to my mind, have shaped the larger ideological contours of historians' engagement with past in 20th century. So, it is extremely crucial to pay attention to what they were arguing and how they were looking at history. And here I would also like to offer a disclaimer that I am not going to engage with each and every historiographical discussion, debates around specific events or specific socio-economic contexts. It is beyond the scope of this series of lectures. Each event or each thread, for example, when we look at Swadeshi movement, there is a wide range of scholarship available on Swadeshi movement, and then we have a magna opus book by Sumit Sarkar coming from early 1970s. Similarly, we have a very deep and very enriching debate around issue of deindustrialization. Similarly, about different political events, be it Quit India movement, be it Gandhi's campaigns in 1920s and 30s. So, it is not possible to engage with each and every debates, we will definitely in the course of these lectures will pay attention to or refer back to these debates whenever important. But we are trying to get an overview, trying to cull together some general trends, deeper structures of ideas governing historiographical trajectory. So, the focus of our lectures are to cull out, to deal with overarching frames and cull out deeper strands which have shaped the scholarship at broader level in the last 2-3 centuries. Then today we will go into the institutionalization of history writing broadly from mid 1940s onwards, and we will pay particular attention to these institutionalized efforts in the decade of 1950s. And there we would hopefully witness that how gradually historical scholarship tend to get framed within academic investment in history. By this I would try to delineate broad contours between history writings which took place in 19th and 20th century, early part of 20th century, and the academic history writing from 1950s onwards. So, let us start with Bankim Chand Chattopadhyay. His dates are 1838 to 1894. He was one among the most widely read scholar individual in Bengal in his own times, well versed in European literature, philosophy, sociology, and scholars have pointed out his deep involvement particularly in the ideas of positivism and utilitarianism. He raises, obviously we are not going to cover his entire corpus and will be selective in our approach for merely pragmatic reasons. He asked a core question, one of the most crucial questions which has shaped the historiography and which has bothered many generations of historians, and the question is that why has India been a subject nation for so long? In one or another form, this question has been asked by different scholars, different political leaders. When Bankim is raising this question, he is not merely looking at European rule, but he is saying that his frame is of 700 years of foreign rule. So, he is including the medieval as well as British period. To answer this question, why has India been a subject nation for so long, identifies that Indians have been subjected for last 700 years because Indians lack physical strength and courage. He gives two reasons for this. He says that Indians lack a natural desire for liberty. To substantiate this, he writes that for more than 3000 years, and this is from Bharatvarsh Paradhin Kena. This has been translated into English, and the version I am using is by Partha Chatterjee. The translation is by Partha Chatterjee in his book Nationalist Thought and the Colonial World, a Derivative Discourse, and I quote, "For more than 3000 years, Aryans have fought against Aryans, or Aryans against non-Aryans, or non-Aryans against non-Aryans. Magad has fought Kannauj, Kannauj has fought Delhi, Delhi has fought Lahore. Hindus have battled against Pathans, Pathans against Mughals, Mughals against the English. All of these people have fought against one another and continually stoked the fires of war in this country. But all of these were battles among kings. Hindu kings or the rulers of Hindustan have been repeatedly conquered by alien people, but it cannot be said that the bulk of Hindu society has ever been vanquished in battle, because the bulk of Hindu society has never gone to war." Quote ends. So, the argument is that because a bulk of society has never gone into war for their own sake, so there has never been a consciousness, a yearning, a desire for liberty. Second reason he offers is lack of solidarity among the people of the country. And there he points to the diversity and internal conflicts, the divisions along various lines. Both these explanations are in the realm of culture. So, the core argument is that for Bankim Chandra, the question of nationalism was deeply rooted in the realm of culture. Now, another clarification we need to bear in our mind when we are looking at Bankim Chand's literature is that sociologically speaking, for him people of India is pitted against the Europeans. So, this is the order of the European. Sometimes this order is referred as Bengali, sometimes it is referred as Hindu, sometimes he refers to entire Bharatvarsha, sometimes he uses the word inhabitant of India, on another occasion he uses the word Bengal. So, these categories often gets conflated in his writing. Coming back to his original question, his search for reasons of the natural lack of desire for liberty among Indians, he immediately goes into history of India, particularly the philosophical traditions. He harps on Sankhya philosophy and finds a solution, finds a response to his question in deep influence of Vairagya in shaping Indian psyche. He argues that it is due to this centrality of Vairagya in our psychological makeup, there is an excessive emphasis we place on otherworldliness. This then leads to lack of devotion to work. This is, on the other hand, gets aggravated by heavy reliance on fatalism. He very interestingly then argues that the slogan of Western civilization is knowledge is power, while our slogan is knowledge is salvation. So, we all the time try to attain salvation and are less concerned about hard work or the concerns for the power. In this way, power or lack of power is a social phenomena, and there the physical strength or lack of physical strength depends on 4 elements: enterprise, solidarity, courage and perseverance. He says that Bengalis as a people always lacked these elements. Again, when I am talking about, I am referring here Bengalis, we must bear in mind my earlier caution that he conflates categories, sociological categories. So, often when he is alluding to Bengalis, he is also somewhere oriented to address the Indians as a whole. Same in the case of Hindus. So, he says that Bengalis as a people always lacked these elements, these 4 elements that we have just come across. And if I quote, he says that if ever the Bengalis acquire a compelling desire for some good, if this desire becomes compelling in every Bengali heart, if this compulsion becomes so great that people are prepared to stake their lives for it, and fourth, if this desire becomes permanent, then the Bengalis would certainly become a powerful people. To remind you that this excessive concern to power is again rooted in his core question, why India has been subjugated for so long, and it is this yearning which is then leading him to theorize the reasons for the lack of this power. Here 4 positions are implied. Force of power is the basis of the state. Second, the liberty or subjection of a nation is ultimately a question of force of power. Third, power is not something that is determined by material conditions. And fourth, power can be acquired by the cultivation of appropriate national cultural values. Bankim's method and mode of reasoning was deeply rooted in post-enlightenment scientific thoughts, and here principles of historicity was an essential procedure for acquiring objective knowledge. Now, again I would like to remind that because in this concept power is a social phenomena, and this social phenomena in his scheme of things is directly determined by the course of history. And if you recall, this is why we went into the philosophical trajectory of Sankhya and Vairagya. Now he is coming to the principles of historicity, because history in his scheme of things is not merely a source to examine the lack of power or lack of desire among Indians for liberty, but it is the playground, it is the contested field where Indians must contest the constructs offered by British Orientalist scholars. And there he is talking about principles of historicity as essential procedure for acquiring objective knowledge. And he argues that for self awareness of a people, the knowledge of their own history is essential. And because he was deeply rooted in positivist understanding of history, so when he was writing Krishna Charitra in 1886, he goes on to establish the historicity of the character of Krishna and trying to find the original historical account of the life of Krishna. So, history to him was the receptacle of rational truth. Conversely, the validation of truth had to lie in a rational demonstration of its historicity. Thus, when he is looking for the historicity of life of Lord Krishna, he is quite enraged by Albrecht Weber's claim that Mahabharata could not have existed in the 4th century BC, because Megasthenes did not mention to Mahabharata in his account. In a very satirical and scathing criticism, he ridicules Albrecht Weber's this method of negating the possibility of Mahabharata because a foreign traveler's account does not mention it. He says that, for example, if somebody from India is visiting Germany and in his account, in his travelogue, does not mention the name of Albrecht Weber, that does not mean that Albrecht Weber never existed. The point here is that he was critical of Orientalists, and he says that their account is insufficiently factual. They lacked a deeper understanding of sources, a fuller understanding of sources. At Social Terrain, it is interesting, and we must need to remember that for Bankim Chandra, the caste system was deeply a matter of concern. He compared colonial order in India with a historical reconstruction of caste system, and with this comparison he admitted that British rule had established a fairer and more impersonal legal and judicial system, which gives greater access, at least in principle, for the lower castes to positions of power and status. And had made available the means for Indians to acquire the benefits of Western science and literature. These contributions of colonialism he duly acknowledges. He says that due to colonialism, while the position of upper caste may have declined due to loss of liberty, but for lower class the same is not true. For one who is oppressed, it makes no difference whether the oppression is one's compatriot or whether he is foreign. If I quote his words, he writes that the condition of the upper classes such as Brahmans and Kshatriyas has declined due to British imperialism, but that of Sudras or ordinary people has improved. Now, to sum up, we may see that Bankim Chandra was locating his nationalist critique at civilizational lines, at civilizational landscapes where culture and history both play extremely crucial role, and from there he identifies the lack within Indian society rather than all the time rejecting or complaining Britishers for ruling India. So, in that sense, this is a deeply self-critical reflection on the question of nationalism and imperialism. His ideas influenced generations of intellectuals and historical scholarship, particularly his ideas were closely followed by people like Aurobindo and obviously shaped the nationalist constructs in 20th century. From Bankim Chandra moving to Rabindranath Tagore, another extremely crucial personality when we are talking about people or ideas influencing the wider terrain of historiography in 20th century, particularly concerning the question of nationalism. Tagore's significance and centrality cannot be undermined. In Tagore, we find 4 different phases. The first phase we can roughly identify between 1877 to 1902, where his ideas were quite similar to, though not identical, but one can see lot of commonalities between Tagore and Bankim. We are going to skip that phase. The second phase is from 1902 to 1917, and this was the phase when he was quite active in organizing protest activities against anti-partisan, organizing protest against the partition of Bengal and Swadeshi movement in 1905-6. Following Swadeshi movement, as we know, he had a disenchantment with politics. So, this second phase between 1902 to 1917, we come across maturization, crystallization of his thoughts around nationalism and history. The third phase is following the World War I, particularly Jallianwala Bagh episode, which motivated him to return his award to British government as a token of protest, and the ravages of World War I deeply pained him, which led him to reflect on the issue of nationalism, perhaps one of the most powerful critique of idea of nationalism which we come across in the entire course of 20th century. We will come to that quite soon. And then the fourth phase is from 1921 to 1941. So, let us start with his idea of Indian history. In 1902, he wrote a seminal essay on Indian history. This was titled as History of India, and he suggested a concept which was going to be frequently used and perhaps the most widely coined, perhaps the most widely used idea from mid 20th century onwards. The idea was that he said that India is a syncretic civilization. Now, we will come across, we will see that this concept of India as a syncretic civilization has been used to articulate our belief in unity in diversity, a framing epithet for historians of independent India for a very long time. As I said, the key feature of the third phase from 1917 to 21 was his critique of Europe's aggrandizing nationalism, aggressive nationalism, and in his final in the phase between 1921 and 41, he was more concerned with fault lines of caste and community, which was threatening this notion of syncretic civilization. This was the period when communal violences and caste question deeply pained him. In the beginning, he was quite dismissive of textbook accounts of history. For these accounts of history are all about invasions and battles and the founding of and dissolution of dynasties. He is obviously talking about his own times, the textbooks with which he grew up, and he says that in these accounts of history there is no engagement with the life of people of this country. He writes that in failing to look at India from our own point of view, we learn from our childhood to diminish India and thus to diminish ourselves. Then he goes on to seek the answer. He first raises this question that why these historical writings by the British are so flawed, and he provides this answer that these accounts are quite insensitive to Indian experiences, because these accounts are flawed because these are written from rulers' point of view. So, he is unlike Bankim, he is not talking about the authenticity of sources or insufficiency of information among Orientalists. He is scathingly pointing to the entire perspective itself, the vantage point itself. These accounts are insensitive because these were written from rulers' point of view. So, by emphasizing that the history accounts are so far written from rulers' point of view, he says that the difference is because of difference between civilizations of Europe and India. So, again, unlike Bankim, Tagore is not disputing at the terrain of knowledge, but the difference in history is difference in civilization, is due to the difference in civilization. So, it is the civilizational energy which shape the contours of history in Tagore's scheme of things. He then builds on and argues that while European history is state centered and its basis is aggression, Indian civilization rests on syncretic unification, syncretic energy. If I quote, and this is again from his 1902 essay, The History of India, which was later on translated by Sir Jadunath Sarkar in 1914, and I am using this translation, and I quote, "We can see that the aim of Bharatvarsha has always been to establish unity amidst differences or diversities, to bring to a convergence of different paths, and to internalize within her soul the unity of the severality, that is to say, to comprehend the inner union between externally perceptible differences without eliminating the uniqueness of each element. Bharatvarsha has endeavored to tie up diversities in a relationship. Bharatvarsha, I repeat, Bharatvarsha has endeavored to tie up diversities in a relationship. If there be genuine differences, it is possible to accommodate in its appropriate places such differences. You cannot legislate unity into existence. Elements which cannot assimilate need to be recognized and put in their appropriate separate places. Bharatvarsha knew the secret of this mode of unification. Bharatvarsha limited the conflict between opposing and competing elements in society by keeping them separate and at the same time engaged in a common task that brought diverse elements together. Quote ends. So, this was one crucial strand that we need to keep in mind, the idea of syncretic civilization, which he considered as the core strength of Indian civilization, and in that way Indian nationalism, the core feature of Indian nationalism. However, when we equate the civilizational energy and combine it to nationalism, as I just mentioned, we must bear in mind that I am mentioning this to underscore the manner in which this idea of syncretism has shaped the terrain of historiography, historical scholarship. When historians, as I argued earlier and I repeat, when historians from mid 20th century started harping on the concept of unity in diversity. For Rabindranath Tagore, it is important, and this is why I delineated 4 stages. It is important to remember that in 1921, when he was deeply disenchanted by the violence of World War I and then Jallianwala Bagh, and when he came face to face with the ugly nature of nation state and nationalism, he came up with his criticism of nationalism. And he says that, but again he differentiates. He says that the organized selfishness of nationalism was alien to Indian civilization. India has never had a real sense of nationalism. If I quote once again, he writes that even though from childhood I have been taught that idolatry of nation is almost better than reverence for God and humanity, I believe I have outgrown that teaching. This is from 1917, where he is already rejecting the idea of nationalism and its power in shaping our mentality. His essay on nationalism, which came up in 1921, is already quite well known, and I am not repeating that. However, here I would like to end our engagement with Rabindranath with this quote from 1922, again a critique of the idea of nationalism. And I quote, this is from Essays and Speech which he delivered in America, North America in 1922, and I quote, nationalism is the training of a whole people for a narrow ideal, and when it gets hold of their minds, it is sure to lead to moral degeneracy and intellectual blindness. It is the emphasis laid in Europe upon the idea of nation's constant increase of power, which is becoming the greatest danger to man, both in its direct activity and its power of infection. Men, he continues to argue, men are taught by repeated devices the lesson that the nation is greater than the people, while yet it scatters to the winds of the moral law that the people have held sacred. Quote ends. So, in today's lecture, we paid attention to the ideas of two individuals, Bankim Chand Chattopadhyay and Rabindranath Tagore, and we have also come across that in both these ideas there are many shades of nationalism, and the idea or philosophy of nationalism is never monolithic. It is these shades which make the terrain of nationalist historiography also quite diverse and rich in layers. The richness we often get lost in political debates and commonsensical understanding of nationalism in India. Another core point was the coming together or the ambiguous relation between civilizational terrain and the political terrain, between culture and nation as category. And both in Bankim and Rabindranath Tagore, we find a greater emphasis on looking at the civilizational energy and their differentiating India from the Western traditions. Both of them, however, while Bankim was quite inward looking as he began to with the question, why has India been subjected to foreign rule for last 700 years, and he was trying to look inward for the causes. He was pointing both to the positive as well as drawbacks of Indian civilization. Rabindranath was harping on the positive dimensions. Positive, I am obviously using a crude sense of the term as a kind of value laden, we know, term, but in order to highlight the strength of Indian civilization. So, this difference as well as common threads we need to keep in our mind when we are looking at the ideas of Bankim and Rabindranath. In our next lecture, which is we will continue our engagement with nationalist historiography, and we will look at the remaining threads that I mentioned in the very beginning, which are engagement with Mahatma Gandhi's idea and its significance, and then the way institutionalization of historical scholarship took place from mid 1940s onwards. that is in our next lecture. Thank you.